senior Republican members of the House have finally admitted that Russia seems to have infiltrated the U.S. Congress. Just how has Russia gotten into our highest levels of government, and what exactly are they trying to do? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So this is actually a crazy story. Mike Turner, this is a very senior House Republican. He's actually the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, meaning that he has access to a level of intel that very few Americans have access to, right? This is someone who receives routinely highly classified briefings, probably directly from senior CIA, NSA, DIA officials. So when someone like this talks, you should probably listen, right? And Mike Turner is not a just rando fly-by-night, two-term representative here. This is someone who has been in office. Let's see if we can figure this out. He was basically almost 20 years, including he was at one point president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. He was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Ohio for literally 20 years. So this is someone who is unbelievably qualified and well-connected, right? So I say this because this is someone who has a long career of public service and is highly trusted, right? Again, president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, a huge honor. And you notice that this took place actually during the Trump administration, or excuse me, the Obama administration, right? So bear this in mind. This is someone who is a Republican who was so trusted to do his job that even though he was from the opposition party, he still got put in this key role, right? And then it's not an accident that he ended up on the House Intelligence Committee. So again, I say this because this is someone who you should trust when they come out and speak, right? And so here's the thing. He's not the only one doing it, right? You may think, oh, Ohio, it's a swing state, but the House Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Michael McCaul, a Republican from Texas, right? The reddest of the red states, both of them have acknowledged that Russian propaganda has infected the Republican Party, right? Michael McCaul saying, quote, that Russian propaganda has infected a good chunk of my party's base. Mike Turner agreeing, saying, quote, it's absolutely true that Russian propaganda has made its way into Congress. So let's specifically, what is he talking about? Well, he reported being shocked that his colleagues are even repeating Russian propaganda points. And he said, quote, we see, he's probably referring to the U.S. intelligence community, we see directly coming from Russia communications that are anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia in their messages, and some of which we hear being uttered on the House floor. And what that is a tried and true, he's describing a tried and true Russian propaganda tactic, one that they've been using for almost a decade now. And that is where Russia creates these talking points. They're often salacious or crazy, but you probably can guess what most of them are. They include entirely fake stories, or sometimes real stories that get spun in a fake way. A classic example would be to sit there and go, wow, Zelensky has a lot of money. How did he get this money? He must be stealing it from the government of Ukraine. And it's true, he's probably rich, but he's almost certainly rich because he was a very public, world-famous celebrity before becoming the president. And so that sort of propaganda spin machine, right, which combines a real fact, Zelensky's rich, with a fake implication, he's rich because of corruption, right? So that is the kind of Russian propaganda spin. Another, the quintessential one that actually Mike Turner cites as the most prominent is that the conflict in Ukraine is actually over NATO, which of course he says it's not, right? And here's the crazy part is that we know it's true because one, Ukraine has not been eligible for NATO membership since at least 2014 because there is a de facto rule in NATO that says that you have to control your territory. right? Because otherwise you would join NATO and then immediately trigger a war, which no NATO country wants. And no NATO country wants to bring into the fold someone who's so weak they don't even control their own sovereign territory, right? And so for 10 years, Russia having occupied Crimea and Ukraine having claims on Crimea has meant that NATO membership was never really on the table. And the fact is that while Ukraine was more Westernly aligned and explicitly stated that they want to become a NATO member, and NATO's open door policy says that anyone can apply, applying is not the same thing as getting in. That's like me saying I applied to Harvard last year and therefore I am basically a Harvard alumni, right? There's a huge, there's two huge gaps you have to cross before you can go from applicant to graduate. But here's the biggest evidence, guys. The number one top piece of evidence is that a U.S. journalist, Tucker Carlson, sat down across from Vladimir Putin and asked him, said, NATO aggression, has that spurred your desire to engage and annex or invade Ukraine, right? He asked Putin straight up. And honestly, it was pretty softball. And guess what? Putin said, no, this isn't about NATO. He said it's about Russia's historic claims in Ukraine. You probably remember it. It was 30 minutes of Putin explaining back to the 900 AD era how Russia views its territorial claims on Kiev. Not once did he say this is because of NATO aggression. The closest he came was that Putin complained for several decades he felt like there was a constant miscommunication between Russia and the United States policymakers. That's as close as he came. But when he was asked point blank, is this about NATO? Putin said, no. What more evidence do you need? The US says it's not about NATO. Ukraine says not about NATO. Russia says it's not about NATO aggression, right? Now, you're going to go in and you're going to point out and you're going to say, well, Putin talks a lot about NATO now. And it's true because NATO wasn't involved in Ukraine before, but guess what? NATO now feels obligated to defend its borders because of Russia's aggression. It's very clear that this was not originated as a conflict with NATO. And the fact is that this gets repeated is part of a Russian propaganda point. And Mike Turner says this. He's like, we can watch it, right? U.S. signals intelligence watches in real time as Russians put out these talking points about NATO, right? Russian state actors. They put them out on places like Twitter and in other media outlets they've compromised. Then they get picked up by larger media outlets that aren't directly influenced by Russia. And then they get picked up by the actual representatives who want to repeat what they see as popular talking points to their base. And that is the core sort of protocol that these countries are running now. And it's not just Russia. Russia doesn't do this, but they're not the only ones doing this. You think Israeli talking points about Hamas. Do you notice? I point this out. I'm going to get demonetized because YouTube loves to demonetize you if you talk about almost anything at this point, but definitely if you talk about Israel Hamas. That's why I don't really talk about it here. But if you want access, as an aside, if you want access to uncensored videos, including first-person combat footage, FPV drone footage, really deep tactical breakdowns, I can only do those on combatvetnews.com. They drop twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, for members only. And honestly, if you appreciate what I do and you can afford it, please, become a member, right? I drop those 2 extra videos every single week. And if you can, any one of these tiers will get you access to it. But again, if you support what I do and you want to become a lieutenant tier or a colonel tier, I love shouting you guys out at the end of the videos. It's the best way to support the channel. And I really appreciate it. Like really, it is the thing that enables me to do this. And it enables me to talk about stuff like this. You may have noticed that shortly after the October 7th attacks, and when Israel began to begin their ground operation in Gaza, there was a lot of negative pushback, right? A lot of people said, hey, the average Palestinian didn't do this, just like the average Israeli isn't a victim. The average Palestinian shouldn't be subject to this. This is a huge bombing campaign. And you notice that the Israeli spokesperson or Israeli propaganda machine tried really hard to equate Hamas with ISIS. They actually would start to hyphenate them, Hamas-ISIS. Even though they're not affiliated groups, they're different Muslim sects entirely. They actually fought against each other for a time. But they really tried to draw that comparison. And you saw it first coming from straight, like, Israeli military spokespeople. Then you saw it kind of get into the Twitterverse, and a bunch of Israeli-aligned, like, popular Twitter accounts started to say it. Then it entered the mainstream media because they picked it up, right? Kind of vaguely pro-Israeli or pro-Israeli mainstream media outlets. And then finally, you started to hear your friends say it. Hamas is just as bad as ISIS, or they'd call them Hamas ISIS. It was really bizarre to watch people who I'm like, dude, you're an IT support guy. Why are you repeating Israeli talking points? So every state does this. Every state that wants to influence U.S. policy, which FYI, it's every country in the world because the U.S. is so big that you want them to align with your policy goals. Every one of them does this, which is pretty scary when you think about it. So, but it's not, luckily, we, being the United States and its government, we spend a lot of time and effort uncovering Russian propaganda. And when it happens, we're lucky that we at least have some representatives that still have the integrity to call it out. Right. Now, what's fascinating too is that the best way that both Turner and McCall, again, Republicans from two very different states, acknowledge is that Russia's leader, Vladimir Putin, is BFFs with Xi Jinping. And it makes sense. They have a lot in common, despite having some differences, right? Putin and Xi Jinping both are single-party states with fake elections where they rule them as personal fiefdoms, right? And Kim Jong-un is right up there with it. Again, you can see Vladimir Putin has almost no allies that hold free and fair elections. None. His allies are all authoritarian countries, and that's not an accident, right? Putin is on the team that says you don't get to hold elections. Xi Jinping is firmly on that team too. Kazakhstan, North Korea, all of these authoritarian countries all want to see Putin succeed because it means that a country that, for all of its flaws, Ukraine is still a democratic country where the people of Ukraine choose the general direction about who is in charge of them. And that is anathema to someone like Putin or Xi, right? So it's really, really hard, right, to sometimes get through this Russian propaganda because the Russians are very good at it. Now, you might say, but Paul, Russia, China, friends? Guys, they're actually becoming bigger friends than we've seen before. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is going to meet high-level Chinese officials today, April 8th and 9th, right? And Western intelligence agencies are sounding the alarm that China is stepping up its help of Russia's defense industrial base and even providing Russia with geospatial intelligence. This is usually like satellite photos and analysis. This is a really significant uptick in their commitment. Before China just said, listen, we will sell you, Russia. We'll sell you some stuff. They sold a lot of body armor. They sold hunting rifles. But now that we're seeing real potential high-level defense industrial cooperation, right? So this could be sophisticated weapon systems, not things where they're like, oh, it's a hunting rifle. We're talking like, oh, this is cruise missile avionics, for example. And providing Russia with geospatial intelligence is a huge step up because remember, it's not just like they're going to give Russia access to Chinese satellites. Intelligence means analysis is being done. And that would entail the Chinese military doing some of the work for Russia. That's the key part for intelligence. Either Chinese military like affiliated companies or like shell companies maybe. But the point is that someone's going to go into Chinese satellites, they're going to find information that's relevant to Russia, and they're going to give that analysis to Russia. A huge step up that Chinese military or government personnel are going to actively be helping Russia see and understand the battlefield, right? Of course, NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg telling the BBC that China is, quote, propping up the Russian war economy, probably by selling them a lot of goods and by buying a lot of Russian raw materials, including liquid natural gas and other fossil fuels, right? And of course, they're supporting the Russian defense industrial base, again, probably with raw materials that then Russia can use to manufacture its own weapon systems. And an unnamed U.S. source said that Russia and China have deepened their connections recently. And of course, Anthony Blinken trying to get its European allies to press China on this issue. But again, as we've talked about, that given the level of inflation in a lot of the Western world, it's really hard to get elected leaders to come out and take a stance against someone like China. Because imagine if China was to say, okay, all our imports, you Westerners, they're now 10% more expensive. We're doing a tariff, or we're going to decrease the quantity, thereby raising the price of what we export to you. Well, for someone like the UK or France or the United States, where the average consumer is being hit pretty hard by inflation, they really can't afford to have a major importer or a major exporter like China raise the price of their goods. It's going to, I mean, look at how much stuff is purchased from China. So all of this stuff is a reminder that there's always a multitude of factors involved in sort of untangling these complex relationships. Now, China, as we've talked about, given Russia microelectronics, again, like guidance systems, avionics, things that help planes or even electronic warfare, optics, like, well, optics on weapons, machine tools for tanks, right? These are specialty tools used to manufacture parts for tanks, and propellants for missiles. Again, a specialty fossil fuel product, right? China also is providing Russia with nitrocellulose, an intermediary good used to make explosives, gunpowder, and jet engines. So all of which are essential to continue that giant Russian advantage in artillery. And even most worrying, of course, is the Chinese military directly doing work for Russia. Though there's rumors that Russia may actually be using U.S. satellites to buy imagery from U.S. companies to help guide their long-range strikes. So all in all, guys, again, I think the takeaway here is that we should put a lot of stake into when these senior elected officials come out in the Republican Party and say, yo, guys, you have to understand that Russian propaganda is way deeper and way more pervasive than any of us understand, right? And again, if you're a smart consumer of the news, you won't get tricked by this. But a lot of people, they don't have time to check 15 sources. They don't have time to run down. So they just trust the first information that gets to them, right? They believe all information is equally valuable, whether it is a random TikToker's account or, a 20-year elected representative. Anyway, that's all I had, guys. Thank you so much to our Colonel tier members. Thank you so much to our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. I will see you on combatvetnews.com tomorrow. See you in the next one. Cheers.